read from of a former U.S. ambassador to NATO, Kurt Volker. Ambassador, always good to have you. You know, within 40 miles of the Polish border, that's pretty close. What did you make of it?
It is. I think a couple of things here. First off, we're talking about long-range bombers and missiles. We're not talking about ground forces or artillery or rocket fire because they can't get close. So this is a signal that the military advance has stopped. Second, it's risky to send missiles that close to NATO territory, knowing that if you hit NATO territory, NATO might respond. So they're willing to take that risk and pay that expensive price tag for these missiles because they know that if the MiGs come in, they'll be customized for the Ukrainian Air Force, and that will add to Ukraine's firepower. So they're trying desperately to avoid that. These are signs of weakness coming from Russia, weakness in their military effort, not signs of strength.
All right, now this area that they hit was where a lot of this aircraft repair would happen. So it was by design. But I'm wondering, do you think, given the proximity to the Polish border, that the Russians don't think there would be a response to something like that if a missile went down or went over the border?
Well, it's a combination. I think they're willing to take the risk that their systems are accurate, and so they wouldn't hit there. But then if it did, they're probably counting on a proportionate response, missile strike back, not a major NATO response. They may be right about that, but they may be wrong about that. But I think they're willing to take the risk.
Ambassador, as you know, the president had a one-on-one, a conversation, fairly long one, 2 hours, which even allowing for translation is a long phone call back and forth with the Chinese leader. I spoke to Britain's ambassador to the United States, Karen Pierce, about that, and she set it up as a sort of a moment in time where China has to decide, where do you want to be? I want you to react to this, the British ambassador. Doesn't sound like a country that's dialing things back, either in support of what the Russians are doing. I don't know about military support, but certainly in doing what the U.S. and maybe by extension other NATO countries want. What do you make of that?
If I were thinking of an alliance with China, if I were a developing country and I saw big Chinese support for Russia, I'm afraid I'd think twice about why China was doing that and whether I really wanted an alliance with a country that professes to be on the side of sovereignty and yet condones and possibly tries to help Russia in its illegal actions.
It comes down maybe to their economic interests too, Ambassador. What she seems to be saying is stand up for something, China. And if you don't, your vagueness isn't helping you. What do you make of it?
Yeah, very interesting, her comments, as well as the Chinese ambassador's op-ed in the Washington Post, if people have not read that. China does not like what Russia is doing to Ukraine. They see Ukraine as a sovereign country, a UN member state, and don't think that Russia's actions are acceptable or justified in attacking them. But they don't want to break with Russia. They also agree with Russia that a Western-led liberal economic order in the world is something that China wants to break. They want to replace it. So if they can help Russia with sanctions busting, to evade those sanctions through financial transfers and trade, that could both benefit China and also weaken the Western order. They would like that. So they're in a delicate position here. Finally, they don't want China's desire to reabsorb Taiwan as seen as parallel with Russia's attacks on Ukraine. They view Ukraine as a sovereign country, but they don't view Taiwan as a sovereign country. They view it as an integral part of China. And they don't want to destroy Taiwan in order to take it over. They want to absorb it over time. So they're trying to draw a distinction here. And I think the reason the phone call was so long today was to explore, like, where are China's limits? What will they do? What will they not do? And can we encourage them to differentiate in that way in their thinking?
You know, Ambassador, we're getting dribs and drabs out of what exactly transpired in the conversation today, but we're told that Xi Jinping had told the president that China didn't want to see a Ukraine war. The war reference is something that even Russia abhors. Don't call it a war. They did, and I'm wondering if that is the case, the significance of that.
Yes. Yes, it is. The Chinese are very careful in choosing their words, and they have now chosen to call this a war. He did so also in his phone calls with Scholz and Macron in Europe. They also aired video in China of Russian snipers shooting civilians in line for bread in a city in Ukraine, Chernihiv, which offended Lavrov to the point that he turned his plane around and was going to visit China and flew back to Russia instead. So they are clearly trying to show some distance with Russia's decision to attack a sovereign state and the methods that Russia is using.
Finally, Ambassador, sometimes we can read a lot more about the government's intent in Russia coming from various spokesmen or ministers. And this is a tweet that came from Hua Chunying, China's assistant foreign minister, who had said, and I think, Ambassador, this was before the formal, phone call between the two. The claim that China is on the wrong side of history is overbearing. It is the U.S. that is on the wrong side of history. Now, if he's saying that in a tweet, and that is the view of China on this whole dust-up here, then China is looking at us as the perpetrators here, or at least making a big deal out of this, which I would think is rather obvious. But what do you make of that?
I read that a little bit differently. I think that when we say they're on the wrong side of history, we're saying that they're supporting the aggressor and not the victim, and the victim is actually going to survive and prevail, so they're getting Russia wrong. When they say on the wrong side of history, I think what they're saying is, United States, you're a declining superpower. You're going to have to get used to the fact that China is a rising power in the world. And I think that's a very different conversation, but I think we may be talking past each other a little bit on that.
You know, I said it was the final one. I lied because that's the money nerd here at Fox, Ambassador. I always think that China keeps a closer eye on its markets than it does even wars. And it doesn't want to happen to itself what has gone on with Russia being isolated and financially now shoved in a corner by the world. It doesn't want that because it's 20 times the economic power that Russia is, and it doesn't want to risk that. Do you think that will ultimately decide how far it goes here?
I do. I think that is one big factor. They care about that. Another big factor is that they feel time is on their side. They don't need to break things in order to advance. Russia is desperate, and they see that. And I don't think the Chinese respect Russia very much. China has worked very hard at lifting up its economy, taking people out of poverty. It does not respect human rights. It does not respect democracy. It has designs in its region, but it is also very proud of its economic achievements and is not going to sacrifice them.
Do you think it's embarrassed by Putin?
Oh, definitely embarrassed. I don't think they believed that Putin would be this ruthless, this brutal, and this incompetent as the way this military operation is unfolded. I think everybody thought Russia had a powerful military and would roll in a couple of days, and that has not happened.
No, it is not. Ambassador Volker, very good catching up with you, our former U.S. ambassador to NATO. Kurt Volker.
Hey, Sean Hannity here. Hey, click here to subscribe to Fox News YouTube page and catch our hottest interviews and most compelling analysis. You will not get it anywhere else.